Chris, thank you so much for your very generous and kind and indulgent words. And what can I say? It's been a great pleasure to know you over these years and also to read your work and be enlightened by it. If I may, sorry, I'm reading a text because I don't want to just sort of do it off the top of my bald head. In this, the 2019 Watt Lecture, I'd like to offer my thoughts on some of the voices or the claps of thunder that have broken the silence at the two poles of China's People's Republic, to the north in Beijing and in Hong Kong far to the south. Like the men and women who demanded to be heard during the clamorous era of the May 4th movement a century ago, today China's voices of conscience and resistance, obstreperous voices often, are also determined to speak out of turn. Just as that message of years ago, 100 years ago, and in the various moments since then that I'll touch on in this talk, these voices are so easily distorted, misrepresented, and attempts to silence them are constant. Now, as I said, I've dedicated this lecture to Leung Ping-Kwan, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But first, we'll start with this. In 1997, Ping-Kwan wrote a poem titled simply Ding, Cauldron. And let me just quote from John Minford's translation of that poem. Because this is a lecture about Chinese literature and culture, as well as politics and history, I'll pepper it with some poems, and the poems are all by P.K. Leung. The poem reads, in part, as the Zhou dynasty rebuilt the empire and celebrated the unity of all under heaven, courtiers were honored, ceremonial music was composed, metals were melted, vessels were cast, new injunctions were set in bronze, power was revalidated. The grand banquet was commenced. Noblemen and elders took their places of honor, while savage fauna bubbled restlessly in the cauldron, the Ding. A sober phoenix motif replaced the gruesome masks of the beast. Our humble bellies have ingested a surfeit of treachery. They have eaten their fill of history, wolfed down legends, and still the banquet goes on, leaving an unfilled void in an ever-changing structure, constantly will become food for our own consumption. For fear of forgetting, we swallow our loved ones. We masticate our memories, and our stomachs rumble as we look outwards. Is there a chance that your pomp and ceremony, your circumstance could ever change, evolve perhaps slowly into some new motif, some new arabesque of beauty? This lecture is dedicated, as I said, to the memory of Leung Ping-Kwan, or P.K. Leung Yasi, poet, essayist, and an enduring voice for the city of Hong Kong, a unique Chinese territory. Professor Leung stood here at this podium, or at a podium here at this university, here to present the 2011 Yip-So Man Watt Lecture. It was not long before his death, and how he has been missed this year, above all, a year in which the city he so loved, that he celebrated in his writing for many decades, and which he helped to give voice to, has risen up in protest and rebellion. The 1st of July 2017 marked the 20th anniversary of Hong Kong being subsumed into the People's Republic of China. It was also 20 years since Leung Ping-Kwan wrote the poem Cauldron, which I just read. He wrote it in 1997. The poem was translated by John Minford, as I mentioned. John had introduced me to PK, and we'd used this poem to start a new series in 2017 in our online venture, which Chris just mentioned, China Heritage, chinaheritage.net. That site produces a journal that is part of our little academy of what we call the Wairarapa Academy of New Sinology. Wairarapa is where we live in New Zealand. We named this new series The Best China, 最好的中国. Not just Hong Kong the best China, but the best parts of China that we as translators, writers, scholars of Chinese culture and thought regard in our own way as being something we can introduce and encourage the reading of, that type of best China. I met John Minford in Canberra, in Australia in 1980. He was finishing his doctoral work and translating the last 40 chapters of Hung Lo Mong, The Dream of the Red Chamber, also known as The Story of the Stone. I was studying Japanese, having decided after some years living in mainland China and in Hong Kong where I worked, to flee the Chinese world because of the rising tide, yes, in 1979, of authoritarianism. We'll talk about that in a moment. I was studying Japanese and went to Japan instead for some years. Later I was drawn back into the orbit of China, but it was through John and through Hong Kong that I did so. In 1983, I was invited by John to work at the Chinese University in Hong Kong as part of the Translation Research Center and to work in Renditions, a major translation journal and magazine. The issue of the journal he was editing at the time was titled simply, it was about the Chinese Commonwealth, a utopos, literally a place that didn't and doesn't exist, yet does. A utopos, that is a world of literature, art, ideas and imagination that straddles the Chinese-speaking and writing world. It includes Hong Kong and Taiwan, includes the People's Republic, the rest of the People's Republic of China, and global Chinese communities. Only in Hong Kong, however, that was Hong Kong before 1997, before now, was it really possible to speak about and pursue that particular world, that commonwealth in which all met on an equal basis to exchange ideas, to debate, to discuss, to disagree. That was the world of Hong Kong. Since then, John and I have worked on a number of projects over the last 35 years, all of them related to Chinese culture and translation. Therefore, it is with great pleasure, particular pleasure, and my honor to be here today to remember Leung, that unique Hong Kong writer, to speak about that extraordinary city, and to celebrate as well the art of translation. And for that, I am grateful to the Watt family for allowing me the honor to present this lecture, and I'm delighted that I'm doing so at the invitation of friends like Christopher Wray and Timothy Cheek, both of whom are not merely important scholars of the Chinese world, cultural, intellectual, and humorous and varied world, they are also important translators in their own right. I launched my own Zhejiang efforts as a translator, as a student in Shanghai in 1975. My talk tonight is inspired by some of my recent efforts at translation, although after nearly 40 years of practice, I still find myself to be little better than a mere student of that art and partaking. As John Minford noted many years ago, there's always been a great dilemma in how to refer to PK Leung. To many of his friends, however, he's simply known as PK. Those of you who are familiar with Hong Kong, Cantonese, and in particular familiar with this year's demonstrations will also know that PK has another meaning, one that PK Leung delighted in, because it's also a Cantonese slang term. It means something like, it means something like, to hit, it means literally to hit the street, to fall down dead in the street. It is roughly translated as drop dead. It is also used to mean things like piss off or you bastard. It was most recently used in one particular occasion, mid-September, in this rather humorous rendition of Deng Xiaoping's famous comment about Hong Kong. When the agreement was made about Hong Kong being subsumed into the People's Republic, it was declared that the horses will keep on racing regardless for the next 50 years, in which the situation in Hong Kong will not change. And some of the young protesters in Hong Kong put together this little poster of Deng Xiaoping looking very grumpy saying, "I said the horses will keep running. Who was the fuckwit who stopped them running?" Now this is a reference to a famous figure in Hong Kong at the moment, a man called Junius Ho, who, those of you familiar with the demonstrations will know that this is the most radical, rabble-rousing, pro-mainland political figure in Hong Kong, a lawyer who helped encourage the Fujian thugs who beat up people in July this year, leading to a massive escalation of demonstrations in Hong Kong and leading to the tireless efforts by hundreds of thousands of protesters to demand justice and redress. During the protests in September, because Junius Ho is a part owner of an Australian racehorse, the protesters threatened to close down the racetrack and prevent Junius Ho's horse from running. So the Hong Kong Jockey Club, which is the alternative government of Hong Kong, for those of us who are familiar with the place, they decided to call off the race meet. And then Deng Xiaoping was saying, which of you bastards led this to happening? So that's what that is a reference to. And that PK's name, he would have been delighted to see his name being used in this particular way. Now, forgive my slight excursion, but I felt I had to explain why one thinks of PK every time you hear this expression, which is frequently during these protests. Let me show I'm not getting out of it. But let me turn to a slightly more serious topic, and that is one to do with this reverend figure. This is Qin Shi Huang. PK's poem Cauldron is about Qin Shi Huang and the Qin dynasty and the unification of Qin Empire. Not China. China didn't exist. The Qin Empire, the central kingdoms of the Qin era, which is now confounded with being the China of the last 3,000 years. Anyway, the Qin Empire. As I said, the poem was written shortly before the Hong Kong was subsumed by the People's Republic. It did not return to the People's Republic, just to make an academic historical point, because the People's Republic did not exist when Hong Kong was leased to the British and occupied by force as a result of colonial treaty. It was the Qing dynasty. Therefore, as Hong Kong was going to be Huigui, it would Huigui to the Qing dynasty. It was subsumed by the People's Republic, which, as you all know, was founded in 1949, something celebrated duly on October the 1st this year. So that's why I don't use that nomenclature, because it's very misleading and it's ahistorical. And for historians, that's something I know silly, but it matters. In the potent image of ancient autocratic power represented by PK's poem, it really provides us with a meditation on the uneasy relationship between imperial ambition in the north, which has existed in the Chinese writing, thinking world since the Qin dynasty 2,200 years ago, and those who fall under its sway, no matter what part of this geopolitical territory they happen to inhabit. In particular, those on the periphery of power often feel challenged by this demand of centralization, unification, and also standardization that is imposed from the center. This is something familiar to anybody from Shanghai or Chongqing or Wuhan or Shanxi or Gansu, or let alone the other territories of the northeast of China or the far west or southwest. The poem recalls in particular China's first imperial enterprise, as it was called at the time, Di Ye, that of the Qin dynasty, under the rule of a man known as Qin Shi Huang, simply the first emperor of the Qin. Qin Shi Huang ruled as emperor for only 11 years, shorter than the Third Reich, one would note, and the dynasty collapsed soon after his death. Although that story lies 2,200 years in the past, the Qin Shi Huang as a figure and as a commanding presence, and his imperial ambition and the harsh rule, is known as Qinzhi, a terrifying term in Chinese for those of you who are familiar with it, have haunted Chinese politics to this day. In fact, just as PK's spirit enlivens my remarks here tonight, the spectre of the Qin and Qin Shi Huang also haunts them. In official China, that's a term I prefer to use, that is the version of China that is promoted by the Chinese Communist Party, Qin Shi Huang and his rule are praised for having created a unified empire, no matter what the human cost, create a unified empire with a standardization of writing, with communications and trade. For unofficial China, that is all the other types of quarreling, interesting, livening bits of the Chinese multiverse, for unofficial China, this is the complex world of independent thought of culture of the Chinese Commonwealth that I mentioned earlier. Today, the Qin, as it did for over 2 millennia, presents an unity forged by draconian laws, inhuman punishments, and the crushing of intellectual and cultural diversity. And this is a view of Qin Shi Huang that existed until the 1950s. Nonetheless, the Qin dynasty has enjoyed a special place in official China and in the popular imagination for 45 years in particular. Why? And that is for one big reason, because of this. because in March 1974, just a few months before I went to China to study as a 20-year-old student, farmers in the outskirts of the city of Xi'an in Shanxi province discovered a group of buried funerary statues, of which this is one. They are now famously known as the Qin Terracotta Army, an amazing and extraordinary underground force. These figures were of soldiers arranged in serried ranks inside a huge necropolis, which is still mostly untouched, which surrounds the tomb of the first emperor of the Qin dynasty. That archaeological find was ironic indeed. Mao Zedong, the founding ruler of the Chinese People's Republic, had himself, after all, if you're familiar, frequently referred to himself and his style of government as being very similar to that of the Qin emperor. The Qin emperor had, for example, famously quashed intellectual diversity of his day, the myriad schools of philosophy and contending thought that are known as the 100 Flowers, the 100 schools of thought. He had also destroyed the basic texts of all of these querulous individuals. And that period, that event, is known simply in the four Chinese words, 焚书坑儒, burning the books and burying the scholars. Although there's much contention about how much was burnt and how many were buried. That's a matter for a more academic environment. He rid himself not only of troublesome texts, in other words, but the Qin emperor also deleted their authors and their potential readers as well. It's Chairman Mao in 1957. Some of you be familiar with the fact that 1957 marks the turning point in the history of the People's Republic, in that it was the moment when intellectual diversity and outspokenness were crushed at the behest of Mao, but by Deng Xiaoping, who was in charge of the anti-rightist movement of the purge of intellectual outspokenness. It was in mid-1957. This is Chairman Mao in 57, around the time of the purging of the 100 Flowers movement and the crushing of intellectual diversity. Mao said at a meeting related to that event, to those events, Deng Xiaoping was in charge of the Office of the Disposition of Anti-Rightist Elements. 500,000 men and women were sent into exile, jailed, docked pay, or otherwise imprisoned. Some for 5 years, some for 10. Some, I met many in the late 70s who were being brought back from labor reform, including the writers Ding Ling and Ai Qing, who I became very friendly with. Some were sent off for many long years of exile for over 20 years. That movement is still approved in China today. At the meeting, one of the meetings about that movement, Chairman Mao famously said, "What's so impressive about the first emperor, after all? He only buried 480 scholars. We've buried 48,000. When we suppressed counter-revolutionaries, didn't we also kill some counter-revolutionary intellectuals? I once debated with people in the democratic parties. You people accuse us of acting like the first emperor, but you're wrong. We're much worse than him. We've done 100 times worse than anything he ever did. You decry us for being dictatorial like the first emperor. We readily admit it. What's pathetic is that you sell us short. We always have to fill the details in for you." His audience laughed in agreement with him at that moment. The very famous quote, if you don't know it. He would revel in the comparison to Qin Shi Huang for the rest of his career. In fact, he famously at one point said that, "I am Marcus Jia Qin Shi Huang. I am Karl Marx plus Qin Shi Huang. That's what I am." When I launched Hong Kong Apostasy is a series of articles that I've been publishing in my online journal, China Heritage. Translations mostly related to the 2019, what I think of and describe as the Hong Kong Uprising. I feature another poem by P.K. Leung in introducing it. It's titled simply "Terracotta Warriors on the Rhine River in Germany." One day P.K. came across a riverside exhibition of these terracotta figures, and he wrote a poem, and I'll just quote a little section from that poem. "I thought to see you here, on the banks of the Rhine, standing proudly to attention in the rain. Make me think, you're but lonely soldiers sent to guard some strange and distant frontier, yearning for your long-lost homes and the embraces of your wives. And your emperor, the man who buried so many men of letters and so many books, who was so much more ruthless than theirs your Germans emperors ever were. You're just ancient lumps of clay. You terracotta puppets, there you are, standing dumbly in expectant rows, a product line awaiting market appreciation. Go home. Let your ghouls and your monsters take you home. Those swords in your frozen hands will never pierce men's hearts. The gentle breeze wafting from this riverbank will never heal your hearts. Crushed and broken time and again, the rays of the sun will never melt the cruelty of your history, sealed fast for so many thousands of years in its deep mental tomb. Qin Shi Huang and his haunting necropolis would come to mind again just recently, October the 1st, in fact. You see, on that day, as Beijing marked the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, its leader, who was overseeing an extravagant parade in Tiananmen, as had all of his predecessors, that day, Xi Jinping published a new article, Philosophical Disquisitions on History, Ethics, and Correct Behavior. In the magazine known as, used to be called when I was a student, Red Flag, Hongqi, now it's called 求是, Seeking the Truth. He published this article and at great length discussed the Qin Emperor and his importance and the nature of dynastic rule in China. Xi Jinping's discussion of the Qin Empire on the 70th anniversary of communist rule had a particular point, for it referred to a debate that has absorbed thinkers both past and present, in particular since the 1940s in China. It is a debate that is known simply as by the words 周期论, that is, the cyclical debate, the debate about cyclical history and dynastic rise and fall. It's a topic that has bedeviled people, of course, traditionally in China, but in modern Chinese thought from the time of Sun Yat-sen. I will just refer to one particular aspect of the debate because it still resonates in China today and will lead us into our discussion of North and South debates and contestation today. In early July 1945, a delegation of independent intellectual leaders, that is, non-aligned academics and political activists, were invited by Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and Liu Shaoqi to visit the guerrilla wartime base of Yan'an. The invitation was extended so as to try and curry favor with these independents to secure further support for the Communist Party's policies during the Japanese War period and thereafter. And it was in particular contention with the Nationalist Party, which was led by Chiang Kai-shek and based in Chongqing nearby. Well, not nearby, but to the southwest. On the 4th of July that year, 1945, Mao asked one of his visitors, a very famous scholar and progressive political activist, a man by the name of Huang Yanpei. He asked him what he thought of what he'd seen in Yan'an. Yan'an seemed to be a land of ideals, aspiration, younger men and women all working for the national good and against the Japanese invasion. An idealistic period, and one recorded by many writers and many thinkers over the years as being an extraordinary moment in modern Chinese history. Huang praised what he'd seen. He said to Mao that he thought the collective, hard-working people and their spirit showed something very particular, something unique in Chinese history, a new possibility. However, he said, he doubted that once these people, if they got into power, whether their frugality and their commitment and idealism could survive for long. He predicted that if they came to rule China, this revolutionary group would lose its passion and enthusiasm, it would wane, and he wondered out loud to Mao whether the corrupt and autocratic political habits of China's past would perhaps haunt the future. And this is a representation of that meeting inaugurated by Xi Jinping a couple of years ago of Mao with Huang Yanpei in Yan'an. And they discussed the Zhou Qi Lun, the issue of dynastic return, the inevitable return of the same type of autocratic behavior, centralized rule, demand for intellectual subservience, the end of innovation, the end of all the types of pure living aspiration that Huang Yanpei was witnessing in Yan'an in 1945. Mao responded, "You're wrong. something different has happened. We're doing something unique, we communists. And he said, we have found out the way to break free of the vicious cycle of the past. This is unique in Chinese history. We will not be a new dynasty. We will break free of the tyranny of history. And he said, I quote, we have found a new path and we can break free of that cycle. The path is called democracy. Well, may you laugh. As long as the people have oversight of the government, then the government will not slacken in its efforts. When everyone takes responsibility, there will be no danger that things will return to how they were, even if the leader has gone. Today, Xi Jinping, as you probably all know, has more titles and more direct power than Mao ever had. In 2013, I dubbed Xi Jinping the chairman of everything, because he'd never met a committee he didn't want to chair. And he now has numerous titles. He is the party, state, army, leader supremo of China. He's also allowed himself to be granted the equivalent of lifetime tenure as China's ruler. That started in March 2018. He has repeatedly referred to that exchange between Mao Zedong and Huang Yanpei. He did so again just recently on the 1st of October, citing that we are following in Mao's tradition. We pursued real democracy. It's now called full course procedural democracy. He named it that yesterday. 全程民主 was declared in Shanghai just yesterday. 75 years later, the Communist Party claims to have broken free of China's ancient dynastic cycle, and its democracy will ensure its continued purchase on power and its role over the fate of China. It is Xi Jinping's harsh policies and his personal hubris, in my opinion, that have, however, led directly to two rebellions, to which I will now turn my attention. One is the revolt staged by a lone, brave man in Beijing. The other is the mass, leaderless uprising of Hong Kong. Both are a response to what in Chinese is summed up literally by both groups in various ways as Qin, the rule of the Qin. That's why I thought it relevant to talk about Qin Shi Huang, to bring us into this topic. So it's a bit fuzzy image, but in November 1978, this turning point in modern Chinese history, the end of the Cultural Revolution, Mao had died in 76, the party had gradually been reconsidering its disastrous policies of the previous 3 decades that had led to mass murder, economic dislocation, collapse, and so on and so forth. November 1978, major party congress was about to be held that would determine where China has gone these last 40 years. An extraordinary moment, which I was fortunate enough to live through both in China, in Beijing, and in Hong Kong. By that time in November, audiences flocked to a particular theatre production. Who would have thought? It was a play staged in Beijing, first in Shanghai, then in Beijing. It was just titled this, 于无声处, where silence reigns, in the realm of silence. That's what the play was called. It was the play, and that play addressed one of the most sensitive political issues of the time. That is the Tiananmen Rebellion of 1976, something that some of the older members of the audience may well remember. You see, over a number of days in early April 1976, crowds had gathered in Tiananmen Square to mourn the recently dead premier, Zhou Enlai, as they lay floral tributes to the monument, at the monument of the peoples here, is represented here by that big plinth in the center of Tiananmen. Some recited poems composed not only to commemorate Zhou Enlai, who was regarded as being a hard-working man devoted to the benefit of the people who'd suffered terribly because of the political vicissitudes of his day and because of the actions of his political enemies. They also recited poems that openly protested against the government, the party, and in particular against Mao and his closest followers. The group that later, a few months later, would be known as the Gang of Four, which was always represented by 5 fingers, i.e. the missing one being Chairman Mao. This is a very famous series of poems, much copied and transmitted throughout China in handwritten versions. The crowds increased over the days. Hundreds and thousands of people gathered in support of these protests. There were scuffles with the authorities. A police post was attacked and burnt down. After days of silence, the official media announced or denounced these demonstrations as a counter-revolutionary happened to my counter-revolutionary insurgency that they claimed was threatening the whole of China, the unity and stability of the state itself. The media denounced the demonstrations as a counter-revolutionary insurgency that claimed that threatened China. The People's Armed Militia moved in on the square. Hundreds were viciously attacked and wounded, and there were rumors by the foreign media as well as by foreign diplomats in Beijing that there were also not only mass arrests but also mass executions. Many bodies were never discovered. Of course, people now talk about the 89 suppression, but that the 1976 suppression was infamous as well. In the wake of those events, Deng Xiaoping, as you may all remember, a leader who was brought back into power only a few years earlier to help restore order and bring the government back into some semblance of normalcy, he himself was blamed for having caused all of these problems, and he was thrown out of office and sent off into internal exile yet again. A nationwide campaign was launched to denounce him, which I enjoyed participating in as a young student. I was a 22-year-old and found it all bizarre but fascinating. His policies were attacked, and all of those who supported him were thrown from power or jailed. By 1978, when this play, Where Silence Reigns, was staged in Beijing, Deng Xiaoping had just returned to power following a military coup, the coup against the Gang of Four and the government in October 1976. Yes, it was a military coup. It wasn't an orderly transition of power. It was a military organized coup led by Ye Jianying, the deputy head of the army. And Mao, it was carried out shortly after Mao's death. Now, the Tiananmen protests of 1976, in November 1978, were being seen in a new light. And the communists were launching economic policies that would, for the next 4 decades, be hailed eventually, not until 82, 83, as the reform and open door policies. During this moment, this play played a crucial role in helping people reconsider what had been a counter-revolutionary incident only some days before, as being a moment in which people got to speak their minds, protest freely, and demand a responsive and responsible government. The title of the play, Where Silence Reigns, 于无声处, was inspired by a poem that's inspired this talk tonight, composed in May 1938 by China's most famous 20th century writer, a man known as Lu Xun. And this is the poem. I've chosen a calligraphic version. Well, it's because it's Lu Xun's calligraphy. And those of you who are interested in Chinese should be able to read Lu Xun's handwriting. If you can't, you should go back to school. Anyway, I won't read it in Chinese. Let me just read the English version. The poem in full is a poem actually about China's darkest moments in the 1930s, related to the oppressions of Japan and also the oppressive political atmosphere imposed by the nationalists, the KMT. It reads simply, in simple translation, the vast population of China are all adrift in a wilderness. They dare not even sing a dirge to lament their own condition, for fear that the earth will resound in their sorrow and in mourning. My mind itself is preoccupied, my thoughts extend and reach out to the very limits of the world and all of its people. Suddenly, though, I hear a startling clap of thunder as it comes bracing through this empire of silence. And that's the line I've chosen. Those of you familiar with the 1970s and 80s will know that these lines were repeated endlessly by Mao, by former Red Guards, by individual protesters, by democracy activists, by people and writers in Hong Kong. All points of the political spectrum used these lines to express their desire to be able to speak out freely and express their protest, whether it be taken notice of or not. It was a desire to be heard and not to be repressed or silent anymore. And that included a lot of my classmates who were former Red Guards who felt that they themselves had been betrayed by the darkness of the late Maoist era. It was a terse, Lu Xun's poem was a terse reflection of the seemingly hopeless state of China in the 1930s. And as I said, it was repeated time and time again through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. I've chosen this title, this poem, as the title of my lecture, or the last line of it, as a reference to those heady days some 40 years ago when China was embarking on those reforms, the economic changes, that also had a huge impact on Chinese thought, society, culture, politics, well, not as much politics as well as other aspects of the Chinese world. I would remind you, though, that these lines also resonate with the kinds of protests that have resounded through China for 100 years now, actually for more. In fact, these protests really began in 1898 with the 100 Days Reform Movement, but I won't go into that at the moment. The protests are, those of you familiar, that are all marked this year, or some of which are marked officially, many of which are being marked unofficially. The May 4th protests of 1919. Student protests against the KMT government, against the Western imperial powers, which betrayed China's interests at the Versailles Peace Treaty after the end of the First World War. Those student demonstrations produced a whole era and generation of political as well as intellectual and cultural activists. The 1949 successful Communist Revolution, which, if you're familiar with the history of the Communist Party as it's told not officially, the Communist Revolution was not only a military revolution, a successful overtaking of the nation, it was also a revolution achieved because the Communists, for the years from 1944 to 1949, through newspaper articles, speeches, and various types of interviews, declared that they would bring democracy, one vote, one man or woman, universal suffrage, human rights and protection of basic other rights to the Chinese people, unlike the KMT. If you're interested at all, there's a book that records all of those official statements from Mao, Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, Zhou Enlai, and so on and so forth, that was published in 1999 and banned immediately by the authorities when it did appear. It's published by Xiao Shu, and the name of the book is 历史的先生庄严的承诺. So online you can download and read the whole thing. Those were the promises made by the Communist Party to the people of China, not the things the Communist Party now claims it promised. Anyway, then there's the Tibetan Uprising of 1959, a calamitous and major moment, one that we'll return to in another moment when we discuss Hong Kong, because it was something that is significant to Hong Kong writers and was from the 1980s. The quelling of the Red Guard protests in 1969, you probably don't know that there was a radical Red Guard movement in 1969 launched in Hunan by the Hunan Proletarian Association, by Yang Xiguang and others, who launched a protest that was Trotskyite, egalitarian, anti-Communist Party corruption, and anti-Mao. It was crushed and all of its leaders were jailed for many years. I met one of the leaders in Melbourne because he ended up in Australia as a lecturer in law who died sadly quite early on from cancer. Economist rather, Yang Xiguang. Then there was the Beijing Spring of 1979, when young writers and protesters of all manner gathered in Beijing at the Democracy Wall and Xidan and stuck up posters demanding redress to all of the injustices they'd suffered or their families had suffered for 10 or 20 or in some cases 30 years. One of them is particularly noteworthy, a man called Wei Jingsheng. You'll probably know about him, a famous dissident who was the first person to declare that Deng Xiaoping himself, despite all of his good intentions and his speeches, was becoming China's new autocrat and setting China on the course to yet another era of autocracy and a failure to politically reform and achieve any of the promises it had made to its countrymen and women in the late 1940s. And then, of course, there are the 1989 mass student uprising and protests in Beijing and 24 other Chinese cities, and 1999, the Falun Gong protests that were so disastrously crushed by Jiang Zemin and his friends. Last year, 2018, marked 40 years since the Communist Party re-evaluated its political path from 1949. As you know, in 1978, when this re-evaluation occurred, the party declared that its policies, to a great extent, the policies from 1949 to 1978, were in many regards less than optimal, I think is the way they would have liked to put it. That is, there'd been focus on class struggle and social divisiveness and internal warfare. They turned their attention to economic reconstruction, finally trying to achieve some of the things that they'd set out to do in the 1940s. And the results have been astounding, uplifting, and extraordinary, and they are also praiseworthy. As you know, in 1978, the party vouchsafed to make good on its earlier promises. However, it also avoided confronting all of those other issues left over from history, and those are the same issues that in 2019 have surfaced yet again. The issues related to free speech, to democracy, freedom of association, responsive and responsible government that's not led by autocratic power or fiat. These same issues that have bedeviled the Chinese world since 1898 and have reappeared in forms of protest and discussion and debate and uprisings ever since, for 120 years now, have arisen once more in 2019. And right now I'll focus in particular on one person who has given voice to these protests in the most eloquent and thorough and a bit overwhelming, because he writes so much, way. And in his writing he frequently quotes this line, which is a line taken from a biography written in the Han Dynasty related to the Qin emperor and to Qin rule, Qin Zhi, as I mentioned earlier. It's a very simple line. It also happens to be the line that was printed in a book that my teacher of Chinese, a guy called Pierre Rickmans or Simon Leys, it was the line, the dedication, or the epitaph rather, that he put into his first book called The Chairman's New Clothes. And it reads simply, "Thousands may acquiesce or agree, 千人之诺诺, and none of it is even worthy of one true man, one true gentleman, Shi, who will dare to say no. 不如一世之恶恶." And in this year, in the last 2 years, we've seen one figure who really exemplifies this line and who, as I said, who uses this line frequently in his own writing. Excuse me, I have to go. The man I'm speaking of is a highly regarded specialist in Chinese law, constitutional law, and social thought. He works at Tsinghua University in Beijing, celebrated professor. His name is Xu Zhangrun. He's not only known for his academic acumen, but also as a major essayist and contemporary thinker. Now, Xu Zhangrun is one of many liberal intellectuals. He's a fan of and student of the great Confucian philosopher Liang Shuming, who had a very bumpy career with Mao Zedong. He's also somebody completely au fait with Western literature and culture, great fan of Cicero, among others, and Tacitus. He's read most of the basic Western classics. He studied overseas, but he did his undergraduate studies all in Beijing. He's been working at Tsinghua for some years. He's been a member of a liberal economic and political think tank called the Uni-Rule Think Tank, Tianze 研究中心, for some years. And quite unsurprisingly, well, perhaps very surprisingly for his friends, but unsurprising in other ways, from 2016, he, along with many of his other colleagues, began to express their concern that under the Xi Jinping era, which began in late 2012 and ratcheted up in 2013, with greater oppression, slowing down of economic reform, a drawing back of the types of legal reforms that people in the legal establishment in China were very hopeful would lead to China developing new types of law covering business, commercial transactions, social exchanges, and so on and so forth. All of these things, as you know, have been radically changing under Xi Jinping as the party has reasserted itself as the sole source of authority and power in all aspects of Chinese life, for better or for worse. From 2016, Xu Zhangrun in particular began to write critiques of what was going on. First, they were quite mild. They were typical of the general liberal intelligentsia who were beginning to write in 2013, 14, 15, express their disquiet with the direction the country was taking. And then, as you know, in March 2018, the Communist Party instructed, in fact, the National People's Congress to revise the Chinese constitution to allow the leader of the nation, that is the president of the country, as well as the premier, Xi Jinping is the president of China, the premier is Li Keqiang, to allow them to enjoy more than 2 terms in office. Each term is 5 years. The original change, move away from lifetime tenure, had been introduced by Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues in 1982. Although Deng Xiaoping broke every rule to do with it, since he was the uncrowned king of China until his death in 1994, nonetheless, he made sure that the formal leaders of state and party would have to give up power after 10 years. As you know, none of them lasted until Jiang Zemin for more than a few years. First Hu Yaobang and then Zhao Ziyang very quickly fell from power at Deng's determination. Anyway, 2018 was a momentous moment in contemporary Chinese history because it led to a revision of a constitution that have led not just Xu Danrun but numerous other actively thinking independent academics, writers and thinkers of all backgrounds to start to question whether China was returning to the type of problematic situation in Chinese politics that was first confronted in 1898. I know it seems rather crazy, but 120 years in Chinese time is not that long. Xu Danrun's concern developed over many months, and eventually in mid-2018, mid-last year, he wrote what has now become a very famous essay. And it's called, I translate the title in rather wordy fashion, but basically the title means Our Pressing Anxieties and Immediate Hopes. It's an article that was published online by Unirule in Beijing, then reprinted immediately in Hong Kong, and then reported on in the New York Times, The Guardian, and elsewhere. It did so because the first reports were all, a Beijing professor calls for the rehabilitation of June the 4th and the re-evaluation of what had happened in 1989. I read those headlines and thought, having spent, and you'll see in 2 days' time if you go to the film screening in town, I'd spent many years working on those protests, and I thought to myself, oh no, not another boring Chinese intellectual calling for the rehabilitation of June the 4th on an anniversary, in an anniversary year. So I didn't bother reading any of it. I just thought, I'm sick of hearing this stuff because I've heard it now for 30 years. One gets, I'm getting old and tired. So I took no notice. But then it kept on, there were various other reports of what was in the article, and I eventually read it. It's a 10,000 Chinese character article. I translated it eventually into 25,000 English words because it's written in a semi-classic, it's written in the style of Chinese that really grew into popularity in the late Qing dynasty and the Republic. It's not contemporary Chinese, it's not classical Chinese, it's a form of semi-modern, semi-vernacular literary Chinese, full of cultural, poetic and historical allusions and references, as well as scurrilous jokes. There's lots of dirty jokes and funny asides in there. He never mentions Xi Jinping by name in this piece, but he mentions him at least 5 times using 5 different very erudite classical forms of contempt. Yu Yi Ren, Dang Dao, Shi Rou Zhe, etc. He uses all those types of wonderful arcane expressions to refer to Dang Zhou, the axle. That's another classical expression, the axle. The article is important and remains important because it outlines a thoroughgoing critique of the whole Xi Jinping regime. Not the Communist Party, it's about what has happened in the last few years and what this may well mean not only for China, but for the rest of the world. And it predicts, in a way, it predicts what happened in Hong Kong because the way he talks about imposition of authoritarian rule, inability to respond to meaningful popular protest, and a sclerotic political establishment that ignores all types of intellectual and cultural flexibility. These are the very issues that were at the heart of the types of debates about constitutional rule and change in the 1880s, again in the 1900s, again during the 1940s vis-a-vis the KMT, again in the 50s with the anti-rightists, the uprising of the 100 Flowers movement, again among Red Guards, believe it or not, and again in the late 70s and again in the 1980s. So this is not new territory for those of us who are familiar with the Chinese world. But the thing that really drew me into reading Xu Danrun and taking him seriously and then spending many laborious hours, as my dear friend Bennett noted, translating and annotating his work. I've been translating and annotating his work because I want students who are interested in reading the text and understanding all of the literary, cultural and historical references to understand what they all are. So I publish versions of Xu Danrun's works in just English as well as in a bilingual version with annotations so that people can enjoy the rather amusing historical and other references. But what drew me to Xu Danrun's piece in particular, although he made attacks on this, that and the other, was one particular thing and one particular event, this person. This is a man called Wang Shiwei. You see, In early 1975, when I was a student in Shanghai at Fudan University, Cultural Revolution, China, Mao was not alive and well, but he was alive, a new movement, a political movement was launched. And it was a bizarre movement. It was called the Movement to Study the 33 Quotations of Marx, Engels, and Lenin on Bourgeois Rights. It's a mouthful. 马恩列关于资产阶级法权的33条语录学习运动. That's what it was called. I still remember it. Anyway, I was 21 years old, not even 21, I was still only 20, and I was reading this stuff going, what the hell, 资产阶级法权? Anyway, over the years I gradually began to realize why this was significant, what it meant, and why it's still relevant. Grimly, terrifyingly relevant. What it was relates to the very origins of the Cultural Revolution. You see, bourgeois rights, 资产阶级法权 is a Leninist concept that means after the revolution has occurred, Communist Party, a socialist, forward-leaning political organization, comes into power. It takes over all aspects of society and begins to reform the economy from the base upwards. The substructure, as well as gradually over time, the superstructure, all the laws, all the education system, the media and so on, gradually over time will transform all of it to turn the whole society into a revolutionary society that will gradually over time be able to move towards high socialism, integration, and eventually communism. Now, during that transitional phase, no matter how long it may be, Lenin said there will be elements of the past that continue on. For example, to keep our people who are accountants to keep working so that we can work out where grain is going and how much it should cost and what the costs are and so on and so forth, to keep factory managers involved and doing their job. We need to let those people, or to let soldiers and old generals to be re-employed from the old army, to keep them employed, to keep them involved, to encourage their participation and support for our revolution. We must retain an element of bourgeois rights, i.e. particular wages. There must be a differential in wage system. Not everyone can be paid the same, though everyone should be paid exactly the same and should be paid according to their needs and the work they do. No, we'll need to have for some period of time these different rights. They'll have to have different types of accommodation. Some will have to have better health care. Some will have to have better transportation, even private limousines or other special forms of transportation. Some will need to have a better education so they can better do their jobs. Some will need to have special provisions, better food and better access to all types of services because we need them to work for the revolution. These are all called bourgeois rights. Now, in China, this theory, which is very powerful and influential, was introduced in the 1920s and 30s. In the late 1930s, it began to be articulated by the young revolutionaries at Yan'an with Mao. They'd all established this revolutionary base in the anti-Japanese war period. This is Yan'an, that's a picture in the background of Yan'an. And Mao, as I said, he'd come to power. And he and his colleagues said, well, what we need is to encourage everyone to participate in the revolution and to make their contributions. But we also have to respect the differences we still have because we are all people coming from Shanghai and Wuhan and Chongqing and all types of places, as well as the countryside. We must protect their basic rights as well as allowing our leaders, those people who are actually leading the revolution, doing all the hard work of going into the field and directing the war and so on and so forth. Naturally the soldiers are important. Naturally the workers who are producing foodstuffs and so on and so forth. Naturally the peasants are all important. However, the leaders need to have special care and special access to special goods and food and medical care and so on and so forth, because without them everything would fall to pieces. And so in Yan'an they created, apart from having a subsistence economic system called the Gongji Zhi, a ration system where everybody was paid the same. On top of the rations, another system of privilege was built on the basis of the Soviet experience. 资产阶级法权, bourgeois rights, acceptable, understandable rights. And sorry to bore you with a political economics course, but anyway, this is essential to understanding Xi Jinping and what's happening in China right now. This period is very unique, and this man, Wang Shuwei, one of China's first, most outspoken communist dissidents. He was a party member and a leading figure. He wrote an essay during a period, 1942, and I won't bore you with the details of why it happened and what was the result. He wrote an essay about this type of bourgeois rights, and he said, We've all come here to be revolutionaries, to be idealistic, to change China, and yet, looking around, we all notice that everything is, not only do we have a ration system, we also have what he called it, 一分三色, 十分五等. There are 3 different colors of clothing depending on what level cadre you are, how important you are, and there are also 5 rankings of food depending on how important you are. These are inequities that are very undermine our martial spirit, undermine our sense of egalitarianism, undermine the revolution. Anyway, Wang Shui, for his troubles, was beheaded in 1948, and his story was virtually unknown until the mid-1980s. However, his essay was famous, and I read a bit of his essay in class. We were allowed to read bits and pieces of these negative examples. They're called negative teaching materials, 反面教材, as part of our courses in 1975, 6, and 7 during the late Cultural Revolution, because we had to understand what had led to the revolution. And I read Wang Shui at the time, and later in Hong Kong was able to read all of Wang Shui's works and get to understand what it was all about. So I'd known that the Yan'an debate about privilege and access and special treatment was something of incredible importance to the authorities. I also learned over time that 33 quotations was a movement launched by Zhang Chunqiao, one of the later Gang of Four, Chairman Mao's close associate, who was the man who in 1957-58, during the Great Leap Forward, had suggested to Chairman Mao, what's gone wrong with our revolution is that we know we've given up on our egalitarian policies of the Yan'an period. We need to reintroduce them through a radical move towards communism. And he encouraged and gave some of the theoretical backing to Mao launching the Great Leap Forward. The same ideas, Zhang Chunqiao then disappeared for a while in Shanghai, was busy with various political struggles there. But in 65 and 66, he was the man who then gave Mao, with the support of various others I won't bore you with the ideas about capitalist roaders, about the Communist Party going rotten, about there being a capitalist headquarters that was threatening to overturn the revolution, and that Chairman Mao needed to launch a movement to get rid of not only those who were in the government who were threatening to overturn the revolutionary impetus by encouraging greater bourgeois rights, but who themselves were radically corrupt. And Mao launched a movement that was in part aimed at using young people to attack the bourgeois rights of capitalist roaders. And Zhang Chunqiao, on that wave of ideas that started in Yan'an, that was based on Lenin, then rose to power and great influence to become nearly the Premier of China after acting Premier after Zhou Enlai's death. Anyway, why this all mattered was when I read Xu Danrun, he has a whole section on the party's secretive and very powerful internal privileged system of provisioning. So in China, the Communist Party, once it took over power, also claimed all land in China. All of its buildings and its offices are all in the best buildings or best parts of every major city in the country, not accounted for, none of their accounting, none of the way that the economics of Communist Party power works has ever been revealed, nobody knows. And there's special hospitals, special treatments, special car pools, special education systems, special access to international travel, so on and so forth. This whole world, this massive world of special and secretive provisioning. In Chinese it's just called 特供. And in his article, he's the first writer in recent times to just say, everybody knows this exists, everybody knows, for all the reforms and the rest of it, the party is actually living in a completely alternative reality, and therefore people want to get access to that, no matter how attractive the bourgeois market economy and all of these great reforms seem. The real access to power, influence, privilege and money is through the special provisioning system and the party system. So he names it. He then goes on to do the unspeakable, and he says, I call for, as others have called before me, for a sunshine policy regarding party leaders' assets. You must all declare what all of your assets are. We all know that they are massive. They've all been reported internationally, but we need to have all cadres on the record reporting what their assets, and so on and so forth. His article had many stipulations like that, and I thought, my God, this is somebody who's not only aiming at the very heart of some of the problems that have bedeviled the Communist Party for 80-odd years, he's also talking about in a highly literate, clear and reasonable fashion, and putting together, if one must use that terrible expression, a roadmap for China to move beyond its contemporary autocratic secretive and enclosed form of political behavior that he believes, like others, believe will sooner or later lead to a massive either collapse of the system or riots and disturbances of the kind we've seen in other autocratic systems over the last 100 years or so. Anyway, so that's why I was drawn to the piece, and then I read all of it and thought, although there's many things about the neoliberal turn of his economic policies nowadays I don't particularly agree with, I thought for the reasons of its content and style, these were worth helping people understand. In particular, he said that I am pursuing ideas and writing in a spirit that was first really encouraged and articulated here at Tsinghua University 90 years ago. And in his writing, he referred to this. This is, sorry to bore you with Chinese characters, but to put it crudely, this is a text, very famous text in China now, forgotten for many decades, but now very, very well known, and you'll see also well known elsewhere. This is a text, a little snippet of a text written in 1929 by a famous scholar by the name of Chen Yinque, arguably China's most famous 20th century historian. He wrote it as part of an epitaph for a recently dead friend, a man called Wang Guowei, who was a scholar, a specialist in Schopenhauer's thought, specialist in theatre Yuanqu, Yuan dynasty drama, a specialist in Hong Lo Meng, Dream of the Red Chamber, China's most famous novel, also one of the greatest scholars of the Chinese lyrical poetic form, the Ci poem. Wang Guowei committed suicide 2 years earlier, in 1927, despairing of what the collapse of the dynastic order, despairing of the May 4th movement and what it meant to the destruction of all elements, the complete negation of all traditional culture. He wasn't a radical conservative, but he just felt the world that made sense to him was dying around him. And rather than mourning its loss and dying and seeing its inevitable unfolding, no matter whether one agrees with his view or not, he decided better to just die. And he killed himself. He drowned himself in the Kunming Lake of the Summer Palace. And his old friend and colleague, Chen Yinque, who did not commit suicide, he wrote this encomium, which was written up. Students funded the building of a stele in Tsinghua University, and this epitaph was put up. And I'll just translate just one very small passage of it. It praises Chen Yinque. Chen Yinque praises Wang Guowei for what he calls his, and just the central blocked out, the highlighted words, just read, his was an independent spirit and a mind that was unfettered. 是独立之精神，自由之思想. Now these 10 words have become the byword of every independent, dissenting, thinking person in China, of every background. Everybody knows this expression. First appears here in this particular epitaph. It was eventually the stele in which it was engraved, and here's a picture of the stele with dear Professor Xu Danrun looking at it. You'll see it was used in the poster for this speech. Here's Xu Danrun paying his obeisance to it. He lives just nearby, well, still does live nearby. We'll talk about his fate in a moment. Here he is looking at this stele in the Cultural Revolution was pushed down and turned into a science lab table used for experiments. They eventually found it in the 1990s and put it up again. It's now a prized element of Tsinghua University's campus. And to just quote what Xu Danrun says about it himself, and here's a little passage from one of his essays in which he just says, without intellectual freedom and the independent spirit that have spoken by, exemplified by Wang Guowei and spoken about by Chen Yinque in 1929, what hope is there for people to explore the unknown? Without that freedom, without that spirit, what hope is there for the advancement of scholarship or for intellectual creativity in China today? If the present policy to clamp down on free speech, and he's talking, this was written last year, continues, or if it is further extended, all hopes of creativity and innovation in China will remain unrealized. China will be little over time, little more than a cultural backwater of intellectual dwarfs. And I just share that with you because it gives you a little flavor of Xu Danrun's highly evocative and also extremely contentious writing. All of the stuff he writes is in this style, highly confrontational. On March the 21st this year, That's to finish with Xu Jianrun and then move on to Hong Kong. The same day on which Harvard University's president, Lawrence Bacow, gave a speech at Peking University talking about intellectual independence and freedom of the spirit, Xu Jianrun was notified formally by his university that he was henceforth forbidden from having any contact with students, that he was under investigation by a group including those from the secret police, that his pay was docked by 80%, and that the university demanded that he would have to cooperate in all ways with the investigation. He was forbidden from having contact with any foreigners or publishing any more work. He broke all of those stipulations, and that he must wait at home for a decision about his fate. His response was immediate. He began writing more work, and a group of scholars, economists, historians, legal experts, constitutional experts, and others all started writing in support of him. The two huge petitions were put together, one by Tsinghua University graduates in China, another international petition with thousands of signatures, and I have over the last number of months translated all of that stuff. So if you're interested in the Xu Jianrun case, what it's about, where it comes from, how it fits into the last 120 years, you can bore yourselves to tears by going to China Heritage and reading up about it. And I have gone from being somebody who felt impelled to do some translation because of that connection between the Yan'an era, Wang Shui, party corruption, Cultural Revolution, all those things that I've grown up with. I felt compelled to spend time writing and translating this material and annotating it to help people understand it, mostly because of this person, because Xu Jianrun is an extraordinary figure, daring. He knows what the penalties will be for this. The penalties, as I said, he's virtually lost all income. He's not allowed to publish anything in China. He's followed by the secret police everywhere. He's now waiting for, Tsinghua University said that we have made a decision on your case. It's been handed to the highest authority for them to determine what's going to happen to you now. So just wait. In the meanwhile, when Tsinghua University celebrated its 108th anniversary on the 28th of April this year, he and his friends gathered outside the Wangguo Wei stele at Tsinghua University to protest in support of freedom of thought and spirit unfettered. You will notice the blue what's it called, the blue metallic cordon behind them. The university, to prevent any of them going near the Wangguo Wei stele, put a cordon sanitaire around the stele itself so none of them could approach it. Eventually some of them were allowed near it, but this is the little group of people. And sadly, as some people noted at the time, there are lots of white-haired oldies, but no young people with black hair. That's the saying was at the time in April that I translated, 只见白头翁，不见黑发人. Anyway, and I'm still in touch with Xu Jianrun by email, and I've continued to translate his work. Just as the end of the investigation was approaching a few weeks ago, and he was told to wait and prepare for the eventual decision, he republished a piece about Republican-era intellectuals and leading independent thinkers, and with it he published just one line on his WeChat account before it was closed down, and it just simply read this. I will not submit, Laozi being, this hero, well, it's a sort of kung fu-esque traditional Chinese term, meaning me. I'll not submit, I'll not be cowed. Fuck 'em, in other words, if I may. And 2 weeks ago he was invited by friends to go to Yunnan on a holiday before the final decision was made, and he gave me permission to use this picture of him with a red man showing defiance. Xu Jianrun 2 weeks ago. His WeChat has now been blocked, his email is uncertain, and he's just waiting for his fate. Meanwhile, if one turns to Hong Kong, the same words, 独立之精神，自由之思想. And the title of the book is that, the author Li Yi, my first boss. Li and I and Bennett Lee, who's here in the audience, have known Lee. Well, I met Lee in 1974 when I was passing through Hong Kong, and he employed me from mid-July, July 1977, and I worked for him for many years. This is a book that he published of his essays in 2017, using that same quote, that famous quote from Chen Yin-che and about Wang Guowei. And he said in his introduction to that book, and we'll see why he's relevant to all of this debate, Lee said in this book, an independent spirit is about being possessed of a mind that is neither dependent nor submissive. In the Chinese case, because of the dominant system, like autocracy, the social environment as well as its political ideology, added to 2 millennia of autocracy dating from the Qin dynasty, most people's minds simply cannot break free. As Lu Xun observed in 1925, again quoting Lu Xun as I have quoted him, Lu Xun said, the Chinese have only 2 modes of being. This is not my opinion, but this is what he says. 2 modes of being. That is, there are periods when we long to be slaves, but can't become slaves. And there are periods when we succeed in becoming slaves for a short time. That's quoting Lu Xun from 1925. Li then goes on to discuss Chen Yin-che and the epithet he composed for Wang Guowei in 1929. He laments how far China today is from that ideal expressed nearly 90 years ago, and he said that China's future should not merely be limited to economics and military strength. He says, without a spirit of independence and minds that truly enjoy true freedom, China itself will be without a soul. As I said, my initial encounter with Lee was in October 1974, and then I went to work for him in 1977, and Ben and I translated his work and essays on Chinese politics and the changing scene of China in the late 70s and early 80s for some years. I kept translating him through the 1980s as well, and of now in my 65th year, in his 83rd year, I first came across this book a few years ago and realized he was still around. I have now become his translator again at this very late stage in life. Now, before moving on to the last section of this speech, I'd like to quote another PK poem that we've published in our journal, just titled Leaf Margin. It's about lotuses. It's about a series of lotus-related poems. And this is an image by the New York-based photographer Lois Connor, who among her many obsessions is a lotus fanatic. And we have worked together, Lois and I have worked together for some 23 years now in China. And just a quote from the poem, Leaf Margin, which is really about the center again and the periphery, as you've mentioned with the earlier poems. It says, your regret is that your nutrients never reached the outermost leaf edge. Any gaze of admiration you feel must always dwell on you, the main blossom. On you, center of the circle, your battle-mented crown petal, radiating power, your official story so often rewritten. I am but an obscure point somewhere on the circumference, a smoke signal of trouble scattered by the wind and the dust, a rumor from the borderland, vague outline of an unauthorized history. Seems to be a perfect entree to the world of Hong Kong in 2019. This is one of those wonderful images that comes from the youthful Hong Kong rebellious propaganda world that appears. There's a Facebook page you can go to that collects all of these wonderful images. And this is just not a word cloud, just a word cluster related to this 2019 demonstrations. So this year of 2019, one of anniversaries and drama, is now the time that the Hong Kong story that P.K. Leung wrote so much about, thought so much about, and extolled throughout his writing career, is being told with a fresh urgency and a new meaning. Now, more than at any other time in decades, the Chinese world, along with the international community, is finding itself obliged to listen to that story, no matter how discomforting, no matter how complex, no matter how challenging, it is demanding to be heard. It is a tale that is exciting, exasperating, epical, and also terrifying. It is also one that reflects the unique culture of Hong Kong. And here's a little taste of that culture summed up beautifully in one little poster. Those of you who know Cantonese will know exactly what this is. This is the Anglo-Cantonese that's actually written and spoken and used in Hong Kong. Let me translate it. I've published this in a piece, and I'll tell you where it comes from. It says, Hong Kongers, be sure to go to Victoria Park tomorrow, Sunday the 18th. This is about the 18th of August. Don't only wear black and bring an extra piece of clothing, as well as a laser pointer. Beware of infiltrators, Guai, those or mainland or pro-communist infiltrators. If, it says, you come across someone who seems to be suspicious, that is working for the authorities or the police, write the following on a piece of paper to test them. It's in Cantonese romanization. Do you know what the fuck I'm saying? And then it finishes, we have 5 demands. All must be met. Oh fuck, help me distribute this. Now this comes from a delightful young writer. It's actually posted, it was circulated very widely in Hong Kong at the time. It comes from, I saw it from a writer who I've read before, a poet, a young poet, a high school teacher, an active member of the youthful literary community of Hong Kong, a woman known as Kitty Hung. And here's from her Facebook page. And those of you who understand that reference deserve, well, to appreciate what's going on in Hong Kong at the moment. I won't go into its exegesis because you might find it too offensive. Kitty Hung has written many wonderful pieces about the protests, and I have in the last 3 months been drawn into it because, well, first Li was writing about the protests. Li has been writing about Hong Kong related issues and the problems related to Hong Kong's relationship with Beijing since 1979. And I have read most of what he has written over these 40 years, and he is still writing in a sane, collected, sensible and rational fashion. Ignored for decades, but now suddenly people are finally paying attention. What a pity it's taken so long. But Kitty Hung, in her an essay that went along with the poster, said, a very lovely little essay that she wrote, it's titled, What Gives You Hong Kong People the Right to Resist? This is from the mainland point of view. How dare you rebel and carry on in this violent, unspeakable, antisocial fashion. And I said you can read the full text in English and in Chinese on China Heritage under the Best China Hong Kong Apostasy. It's all there. And I'll just quote one little paragraph. She said, to most Chinese people, and they use in Hong Kong, as you know, Chinese people means people in the mainland. Chinese people, Hong Kong is not so much a place populated by compatriots, 同胞, it's just somewhere to go to shop. It's a city where they get a certain bag or a particular item of clothing. That's all it's good for. When the brand, i.e. Hong Kong, starts to act up and isn't obedient anymore, well, they think, let's just roll out the 1.4 billion people and crush the bastards. The reality is that they've never given a damn about us in the past or who we are or what we want. I'm afraid those of you who are familiar with Hong Kong and have lived there and appreciate and have been aware of what's been happening these last 40 or 50 years, you'll know exactly what that means. As I said in our series in Hong Kong Apostasy, with over 30 chapters so far, all taken from the Hong Kong press or from television or from songs and so on and so forth, I've tried to cover certain highlights of this protest movement. I've tried not to tell people what to think about it. My aim is not to determine what's right and wrong. It's rather to try and reflect the voices, this cacophony of protests from high school students, from young rowdies, from people who get involved with beating up the police, with others who caution pacifism and non-violence, for others who want to negotiate peacefully, for those who've given long-term concern to the underlying problems of Hong Kong, Tibet and Xinjiang, for those who are pro-mainland. I try and give expression to this whole range of complex, cacophonous, disagreeable and disagreeing voices. As I said, I don't have a vote. I do have a view. I have a history involved with Hong Kong, and I'm doing my best to reflect the world that I know in a way that gives access to some of the work that I think readers, and particularly younger readers, might find to be of interest. Those of you who read international press or read the mainland Chinese official press or use WeChat or those other sources, you all have tons of ways of finding out information and forming your own opinions. Good luck to you all. I'm just doing my bit. Having lived in Hong Kong in the late 70s and then with periods living and working there through the 70s, 80s and 90s, and having had a career as a Chinese writer, I began writing in Chinese for the Hong Kong press in 1978 and a 15-year career as a local columnist and writer. I published 2 books in Hong Kong. I've been banned in mainland China for writing Chinese, though I've published there in the People's Daily once, many, many years ago. I've been following events there for some time. As I said, the year 1979, which we celebrate this year, commemorate this year, for me was a turning point, not only for my understanding of China, but also for my understanding of Hong Kong. Because remember, China back then was Dalu, it was the mainland. Hong Kong wasn't China. Hong Kong was a British Crown territory. It was a colony. That's where I lived first. It's a crucial year, and I'll just mention one particular moment, March 1979, because you might not be aware. In March 1979, 3 things happened of incredible importance for the last 40 years of the Chinese world. One was in early March 1979, this young electrician, former Yaoling Yao number 101 high school star pupil, Wei Jingsheng, published, among other things, everyone knows about his fifth modernization democracy, but in March he published a poster up on a wall, the online world of the day, up on a wall in his own calligraphy, that just said, do we want democracy or do we want a new autocrat? There's a direct attack on Deng Xiaoping's leaning into autocracy and reaffirming the autocratic habits of the Mao era. And it was a warning saying that unless fundamental changes happen, China will become a radical autocracy sooner or later again. He was not the only one to say such things, but he posted up. He was then arrested, not for that, he was arrested for supposedly leaking state secrets to the international media regarding Chinese troop movements on the border with Vietnam. Wonderful, one of those excuses. Dian Fuzui, I think you'd all be familiar with this crime of subversion. Later that same month, in March, Mackelhaus, the colonial governor of Hong Kong, on his first trip to Beijing, met with Deng Xiaoping. And Mackelhaus said, I representing the British government, would like to negotiate a continuation of the lease over the new territories. And Deng Xiaoping said, he'd already been briefed on this, and he said, no, we want to reclaim the new territories in 1997. And the two of them discussed and decided that they would now unfold the negotiation over the future of the whole territory, the new territories, Kowloon and Hong Kong Island itself, and all dependent islands. And this began the process, which eventually led to the 1984 agreement regarding Hong Kong, and later the Basic Law and so on and so forth. All this began in 1979, and on the last day of 1979, another epical moment occurred that I remember it well. I remember reading it, I was following all this stuff. It's the thing that made me go off to Japan for years, and that is that the media announced a speech by Deng Xiaoping in which he declared there were 4 basic principles, 思想基本原则, that the Chinese nation must follow. Communist Party rule, Communist Party policy, Communist control over the army, Communist control over education, thought, and all aspects of civil society. I'm reducing a far more complex argument to the 4 basic principles known as the people's democracy. That to me meant, it's all going to go on again and again and again. As I have now experienced 40 years later, I would make the argument that it has gone on again and again. The few moments of light, few moments of hope, but I've never bought into any of that particularly myself. But I've not been against what's been happening. I'm just somebody who tries to observe and understand, analyze, translate, and write about that reality. Around that time, Li Yi began writing and warning and cajoling. From 1980-81 onwards, he formed a group of unofficial scholars and writers to try and convince the British colonial authorities to extend the lease, no matter what. If you don't extend the lease, he said, and I remember it so well from 81, 82, if it doesn't happen, sooner or later, possibly in my lifetime, Hong Kong will explode and there will be an uprising. Because the mainland, Beijing, unless Beijing really carries out political reform, which I don't believe it will, I would like it to, but it probably won't, then sooner or later, Hong Kong will be betrayed and there'll be mass uprisings. That's what I first heard in the early 80s. And I translated his work advising, cajoling, never negative. He was always trying to be positive, come up with ideas, come up with suggestions. If you don't like the joint agreement, everybody should go into the streets and demonstrate. Demonstrate now, 1984. Don't wait until it's too late. If you want to do something about it, get together, have a movement, put some pressure on the Chinese government. They'll take notice because they care. They're worried about the Americans and the British and others. These are things and ideas that not only Lee, but many thoughtful Hong Kong writers, thinkers, and academics had been warning about for years. Another favorite, 1985, Lei Kong, very well-known, best-selling author, incredible character, born in Shanghai, became a PLA soldier, went off to Xinjiang to work, where he was beaten up by his superior officers, and he hated it, was locked up for a while. He then fled and eventually swam over to Hong Kong in 1957 and became one of Hong Kong's most popular and successful commercial writers. In 1985, I remember so well, he wrote an article saying, the joint agreement between Beijing and Hong Kong, and the British, rather, over Hong Kong, is exactly like the 17-point agreement made between Beijing and Lhasa in 1951. They'll break every single stipulation. Just give them time. Don't be fooled. And so that's the world I've grown up with. So what's happened this year? Its scale, its ferocity, its huge constituency, the youthful idealism and energy, and also the sacrifice is something no one could guess, no one could imagine, but that something would happen was something that all of us who've been involved in caring about Hong Kong for many years have thought about. And I said, as Lee noted himself in one of the essays I've translated, he said, most Hong Kong people, one should remember, have come to this place, to Hong Kong, to escape, to be Qin, to escape the Qin. And here he uses a term that comes from the most famous idyllic essay in the Chinese tradition. It's an essay written by Tao Yuanming in the 4th century called The Peach Blossom Spring. And The Peach Blossom Spring is an essay about a man, this period, the 3rd, 4th century AD in China, the Wei Jin era, as it's known simply, is a period of incredible political chaos, infighting and murderous behavior, and also incredible efflorescence. Buddhism has been introduced, and there's a flourishing of philosophical ideas, partly Taoist, partly Buddhist. Confucianism is to an extent shoved to one side. A lot of experimentation, a lot of great literature, great essays, great poetry. Extraordinary moment. And this writer, Tao Yuanming, who retires from office, he can't stand being a bureaucrat, in his retirement he writes an essay called The Peach Blossom Spring. It's China's utopia. And here he describes a fisherman who goes into the mountains and finds a cave, and goes to the end of the cave and discovers there's this whole hidden valley in front of him. An idyllic valley of people who are living in peace and harmony with their world, who are all wearing the clothing of the earlier dynasties. None of them know what has been going on for these hundreds of years. None of them know about the disorder and the horror of their homelands, because they have all gone there to be Qin. They've all escaped the Qin. Anyway, Lee writes that Hong Kong people have be Qin. We're here to escape the tyranny of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. That's why most of us are here. That's what most of us remember. That's what most of us of a certain age, and even the young, are aware of these issues. Over time, the British system, with its traditions and protections, no matter how flawed, how limited it was, they instilled in Hong Kong people a belief that freedom and the rule of law were a natural state of affairs, something that was theirs to enjoy without them having to exert any particular effort. So people got used to it. They didn't think about it, and when they became endangered from 84, 85 onwards, people didn't know to rebel and react and do anything about it. They had grown so accustomed to this environment that it seemed as natural as breathing the air around us. They did not give it a second thought. It simply was. It was a given. It wasn't something you had to fight for. And this is an essay called Back in the Year in 1984. And it's one of the essays I've translated about his attempts in the past to address these issues, and also his understanding of what's happening now, his encouragement and analysis, all of which he writes a daily column for Pingguo Ribao, Apple Daily. So he's still analyzing, thinking, and arguing about these things. His old mate Ni Kwong, who mentioned the Tibetan 17-point agreement, when I translated one of his essays, I included this image from 1989 by then one of Hong Kong's most famous cartoonists called Morgan Chua. This is done right after June the 4th, in which he could foresee one day we'll all be saying thanks for the memory. because one day, sooner or later, there'll be tanks rolling down the main streets of Hong Kong. I just thought I'd show it to you for a bit of light entertainment. In my series, and I'll just say a few more words about that and then bring this to a close. In this series, I've also done my best to introduce, at first I hope to do much more, introduce one of my favorite television shows. And this is a very famous show that's been screening on Hong Kong TV Friday nights for 30 years. It's called 头条新闻 in Mandarin, Hong Kong Headliner. And this is just a picture of the monk Tripitaka and the court eunuch, which is played by Zhang Jihou, who I've become very friendly with, saying that Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, has killed the extradition bill, and here's Tripitaka reading sutras to help the extradition bill, kill Bill, to go on to a better life in the future. And I've translated the whole exchange and dialogue with a video link. Every Friday they do a great show for half an hour. I'd encourage you all to watch them. There's Mandarin subtitles, standard Chinese subtitles, and Cantonese dialogue. Very amusing. I hope if I have the time, energy, and life left in me, I'll translate the last 6 months of Hong Kong Headliner, because they're a gift to those who want to understand that mixture of Anglicized culture, of mainland political humor, which they use all the time and are completely familiar with, Cantonese ribal undercutting satire, and Western film themes and so on, so all mixed together in what is that uniquely Hong Kong world. In fact, I have lived through and I experienced and I still believe that Hong Kong was, and it does remain, a place of cultural possibility, experimentation and expression. It's one that has enjoyed a latitude that even at the high points of the past 40 years has simply not been possible on the mainland. Now that political climate change over the border is extending the threat of Chinese-style desertification to Hong Kong, that city is more significant than ever. As a result of the 2019 anti-extradition bill protests, the international community might able finally to appreciate not only the violence and the demonstrations and the clashes with the police and the tear gas, but also something that has made Hong Kong such a particularly global yet particular Chinese place. And it is that. In certain respects, as I've argued for many years in my writing, Hong Kong is what, in some regards, let's not talk about the colonialism and such, but in some regards in terms of its cultural confidence, conviviality and invention, it is in fact what a modern pluralistic China, all of China, would be like if it weren't for the Qin zhi, the Qin desire to centralize, commodify, simplify, reduce, make into the same dull, monotonous pabulum that is now called 中国的故事, the official China story, where all other voices, all other stories are silenced. And so it is in the work of, it's a world of, the Hong Kong world is one that is, resents and fights against authoritarian party-state behavior. Its language, its food sensibilities, its civility, its obstreperousness, its wit, its rambunctious enterprise, its rudeness, its intelligence, all of these things along with its rabid materialism, its extraordinary self-concern, its indifference, mostly to nearly everything, usually, along with its often supine attitudes to things, and often cowardice, and so on. These are all traits that jostle together to create this very particular melange that is the world of Hong Kong. And that these young people and others put aside all of the five demands, they're fighting to maintain and protect and vouchsafe that, which I believe is a gift to the whole Chinese world, as well as to the whole world. And that's just the way I happen to see it, and I believe firmly in it, and that's just based on a lifetime of thinking, reading, and engaging with the mainland Chinese world, global China, as well as with Hong Kong. Now, I want to very quickly get to the end of this. Because I've been speaking far too long, you must all be exhausted, so I'll skip over a number of things if you don't mind. I'll just skip over a series of slides. I'd have to show you that because it's just too wonderful. And we'll move over that. So this is one of the slogans that's most commonly heard in Hong Kong, which is, if we don't speak, we will be silenced. And just to close off, I'd like to end with a voice that is not a voice. Many of you might know that in late August this year, an anonymous composer who just calls himself Thomas composed and wrote the words for a song that has become known as the Hong Kong anthem, which is this Hong Kong anthem, "May glory return to Hong Kong." Controversial, it's now been declared to be a Hong Kong independence anthem, which is, as you know, the mainland propagandists have, in their usual genius, identified one thing that is a radical distortion of reality, and they pursue it constantly by saying all these demonstrations, all these young people and so on are all after Hong Kong independence. If you bother to read the Hong Kong press, if you bother to listen to what the protesters are saying and doing, if you bother to care about something that's not just in the international media or the Chinese mainland media, you will learn that's not the case. That is just a fabrication. If, however, you like your propaganda fed to you, whether it's by some international version of Fox News or Beijing's version of Fox News, feel free. You can enjoy all the types of prejudices and narrow-mindedness that we get today, all of us, from the White House on a daily basis. Fine by me. Anyway, I will end this with just one particular work, a work of this young man, a man whose name is Jason Wong in English, Wong Yupong. Born in 1993, he's a young deaf choreographer and sign language interpreter. And here he is trying to interpret what the sign language interpreter is interpreting from crazy Carrie Lam. If you bother listening to what Carrie Lam says, you too would be wishing you were deaf. And sorry, it's being crude, but anyway, this is his sort of like, what the? And I'd like to end with Jason Wong, who, in response to this Hong Kong anthem, choreographed and worked with a number of other of his deaf friends to create their version of the anthem. It's sung by a group of young school children, but the performance in sign language is by Jason and his friends. And I think I need someone to tell me how to flip over, because I've forgotten how to flip over. And I'll just show you the video that was released a couple of weeks ago on the 23rd of September, which was, by the way, Sign Language, International Sign Language Day, just by coincidence. And I'll just show you this to end off. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.